February 23, 1945, 9:47 hours, Iwo Jima. The tank rolls forward, slow and deliberate, treads grinding over black volcanic ash. It looks like a Sherman, same hull, same turret, same olive drab paint streaked with sulfur dust. But the barrel is wrong, too short, too wide, and inside Staff Sergeant Robert Meza isn't loading shells. He's loading fire. 50 yards ahead, a concrete pillbox sits half buried in the hillside, firing slit-spitting machine gun tracers into the Marine lines. Men are dying in the open, pinned down, clawing at the ash, trying to find cover that doesn't exist. Artillery has pounded this position for 3 days. Naval gunfire has hit it 100 times. It won't break. It won't burn. It won't stop. Until now. Meza flips the ignition switch. Compressed nitrogen hisses through the fuel lines. The turret swivels. The barrel steadies. And then, whoosh, a stream of liquid fire erupts from the muzzle, 150 yards of burning napalm arcing through the air like a dragon's breath, splashing into the firing slit, flooding the bunker, turning concrete into an oven and men into ash. The machine gun goes silent. The pillbox becomes a tomb, and the Marines stop dying. This is the weapon the Japanese didn't see coming. The weapon that rewrote the rules of Iwo Jima. 8 tanks, 8 flamethrowers, and a secret project born in the cane fields of Hawaii that would turn the most fortified island in the Pacific into a furnace. Iwo Jima wasn't supposed to take this long. That's what everyone thought when the first Marines hit the beach on February 19, 1945. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, ash, and sulfur, a miserable barren wasteland that smelled like hell and looked worse. The Japanese had 21,000 men dug in, sure, but the Americans had bombed Iwo for 74 consecutive days. 74. That's more sustained bombardment than any piece of ground in the Pacific had ever received. The B-24s had dropped thousands of tons of high explosives. The Navy had fired over 22,000 shells from battleships and cruisers. The island should have been rubble. The defenses should have been dust. They weren't. Because Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, commander of the Japanese garrison, had done something no other Japanese general had done in the entire war. He didn't put his men on the beaches. He didn't dig trenches along the shoreline. He didn't plan a suicidal banzai charge. He went underground. Kurabayashi had spent months turning Iwo Jima into a fortress, not above ground, below it. Miles of tunnels carved into the volcanic rock. Hundreds of concrete bunkers, reinforced with steel, buried under tons of stone. Pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. Caves connected by passageways so the Japanese could move unseen, reinforce positions, disappear and reappear like ghosts. Some of the bunkers had walls 10 feet thick. Some were so deep that American shells just bounced off the rock above them. And the entrances, the firing slits, the observation ports were tiny, narrow, almost invisible. You could stand 50 feet away and never see them, but the Japanese inside could see you, and they could kill you. The Marines found this out the hard way. On D-Day, they stormed ashore expecting resistance. What they got was a slaughter. The beaches were a killing zone, black volcanic ash so loose and deep that men sank to their knees, unable to run, unable to dig, unable to do anything but crawl forward while machine guns and mortars tore them apart. The Japanese waited until the beaches were packed with Marines and landing craft, and then they opened fire. Artillery shells walked up and down the shoreline. Mortars dropped into clusters of men. Machine guns swept the ash like scythes. By nightfall, 2,400 Marines were casualties, and the Americans had barely pushed 700 yards inland. The next day was worse. The terrain, if you could call it that, was a nightmare. Volcanic ridges, steep slopes, jagged rocks, and ash so thick it clogged weapons, filled boots, choked engines. Every 100 yards, the Marines ran into another pillbox, another bunker, another cave. They'd call in artillery. The shells would hit, the smoke would clear, and the firing would start again. Flamethrowers helped. The Marines had man-portable flamethrowers and they used them, but getting close enough to use one was suicide. The range was maybe 30 yards. You had to walk up to the bunker, exposed, carrying a tank of jellied gasoline on your back, and hoped the Japanese didn't shoot you before you could pull the trigger. Most of the time, they did. Satchel charges, grenades, bazookas, nothing worked. The bunkers were too strong, the caves were too deep, and Kurabayashi's men weren't retreating. They were waiting for the Americans to come to them, waiting to kill as many as they could before they died. By the end of the first week, the Marines had taken Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak on the southern tip of the island. The flag raising on the summit became the most famous photograph of the war. But the fighting wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because the rest of Iwo Jima, the northern two-thirds, the ridges and plateaus and fortified zones, was still in Japanese hands, and the casualty rate was climbing every single day. The Marines needed something new, something the Japanese couldn't hide from, something that could get inside those bunkers and burn them out. They needed fire. 6 months earlier, halfway across the Pacific, Colonel George F. Unmacked had a problem. Unmacked was a Marine Corps officer stationed at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, and he'd been tasked with figuring out how to break Japanese fortifications without losing half his men in the process. The island-hopping campaign was grinding forward. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and every battle was the same story. The Japanese dug in. The Americans attacked. Thousands died. There had to be a better way. Unmacked had an idea, flamethrowers, but not the backpack kind that got Marines killed. He wanted flamethrowers on tanks, big ones, powerful ones. Flamethrowers that could stand off 150 yards from a bunker and pour fire through the firing slits without exposing a single infantryman. The problem was, the Marine Corps didn't have flamethrower tanks. The Army had a few experimental models, M3 Grants and M5 Stuarts fitted with Canadian Ronson flamethrower systems, but they were clunky, unreliable, and too light for the kind of fortifications the Japanese were building. Unmacked needed something better, something purpose-built. Something that could survive combat on a Pacific island and still throw fire like the devil himself. So he built it. Working with a small team of engineers and mechanics at Schofield Barracks, Unmacked began converting M4A3 Sherman tanks into flamethrowers. The design was brutal in its simplicity. Rip out the 75 main gun, replace it with a flamethrower nozzle, and mount two 290-gallon napalm tanks inside the hull. The fuel was a mix of gasoline, diesel, and a thickening agent that turned it into a sticky, burning gel that clung to whatever it touched and burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The propellant was compressed nitrogen, no explosives, no ignition risk, just pure pressure pushing the napalm out through the nozzle at 150 yards. They called it the CBH-1. The Marines called it the Zippo, as in the cigarette lighter, because that's what it did. It lit things up. The first test firing happened in the cane fields outside Schofield Barracks. Unmacked and his team built a mock Japanese pillbox out of concrete and steel, identical to the ones the Marines were facing in the Pacific. They positioned the Zippo 100 yards away, loaded the napalm, fired. The result was catastrophic. The stream of burning gel shot across the field, splashed into the firing slit, and flooded the interior of the bunker. Within seconds, the temperature inside spiked to over 2,000 degrees. The concrete began to crack. The steel began to glow. Anything flammable, wood, fabric, human flesh, vaporized. The test was over in less than a minute. The pillbox was a furnace. Unmacked knew he had something. He just had to convince the Corps to use it. By December 1944, 8 Shermans had been converted into Zippos. They were loaded onto transport ships and sent to Iwo Jima as part of the 5th Marine Division. The crews, men like Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, Corporal Raymond Hernandez, and Private First Class Eugene Sledge, were given crash courses in how to operate the flamethrower system, how to load the napalm, how to pressurize the nitrogen, how to aim, how to fire, how to survive. Most of them had never seen a flamethrower tank before. None of them knew if it would work in combat. But they were about to find out. Because on February 19, 1945, the Zippos rolled ashore at Iwo Jima, and the Japanese had no idea what was coming. The Zippos didn't go ashore on D-Day. The beaches were too chaotic, too crowded, too deadly. The Marines needed room to maneuver, and on February 19th, there was no room, just bodies and wreckage and burning landing craft. So the flamethrower tanks waited offshore while the infantry bled, waited while the Marines clawed their way up the beaches and into the ash, waited until there was enough space to land, enough ground to fight on, enough need to justify the risk. That moment came on February 21st, day 3 of the battle. The Marines were stalled, pinned down, every advance measured in yards, every yard paid for in blood. The 5th Marine Division, the unit assigned to push north from Mount Suribachi toward the Matayama Plateau, was running into a wall of bunkers and pillboxes that artillery couldn't crack and infantry couldn't touch. The order came down, bring in the Zippos. Staff Sergeant Robert Meza's tank was one of the first to roll off the LSD. The landing ramp dropped and the Sherman lurched forward, treads biting into the black sand, engine roaring, turret swiveling. Meza sat in the gunner's seat, hand on the firing controls, eyes scanning the terrain ahead. He'd trained for this. He'd practiced. But training doesn't prepare you for the sound of bullets pinging off armor, or the sight of dead Marines half buried in the ash, or the smell, the smell of sulfur and smoke and burning flesh. The tank commander, a lieutenant whose name Meza never remembered, tapped him on the shoulder and pointed. There, 11 o'clock, pillbox. Meza swung the turret, locked onto the target, a concrete bunker low and squat, half buried in the hillside, firing slits barely visible, machine gun tracers stitching the air. Marines were pinned behind a ridge 50 yards away, unable to advance, unable to retreat. They'd been there for hours. Meza flipped the ignition switch. The flamethrower hissed to life. He could feel the pressure building in the tanks behind him, 290 gallons of napalm ready to burn. He steadied the turret, lined up the shot, and fired. The stream of fire erupted from the nozzle like a volcanic jet, bright orange, impossibly long, arcing through the air and splashing into the firing slit of the pillbox. The napalm poured inside, flooding the bunker, igniting everything it touched. Within seconds, black smoke began pouring out of every crack and seam. The machine gun stopped firing. The bunker went silent. And then it started screaming. The sound, Meza would remember it for the rest of his life. High-pitched, inhuman, the sound of men burning alive inside a concrete box with no way out. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe less, and then it stopped. The bunker was a tomb. The Marines behind the ridge stood up, stared. One of them waved. Another gave a thumbs up. They'd been pinned down for hours watching their buddies die, unable to move, and in less than a minute the Zippo had ended it. Meza didn't feel like a hero. He felt nauseous, but the tank commander was already pointing to the next target. There, 2 o'clock, another one. They burned that one too, and the next one, and the next. By the end of the day, Meza's Zippo had destroyed 6 bunkers, 6 positions that artillery couldn't touch, that infantry couldn't crack, that had been killing Marines for 3 days straight. Gone, burned, silent. The other Zippos were doing the same. 8 tanks spread across the 5th Marine Division's front, systematically eliminating bunkers and pillboxes that had held up the advance for days. The Japanese didn't know how to respond. They couldn't hide from the fire, couldn't run from it, couldn't fight it. All they could do was die. And the Marines, the infantry who'd been bleeding and dying in the ash for 3 days, started moving again, advancing, pushing north, because the Zippos had opened the door. But the Japanese weren't done. Not yet, because Kurabayashi had built something into his defenses that even the Zippos couldn't easily reach: tunnels, miles of tunnels, and inside those tunnels thousands of men were still waiting. The problem with flamethrower tanks is that they're designed to burn things you can see. Bunkers, pillboxes, firing positions, but Iwo Jima's real defenses weren't above ground. They were below it. And burning a bunker doesn't mean anything if the Japanese can just retreat into a tunnel, wait for the tank to leave, and reoccupy the position an hour later. The Marines learned this the hard way. They'd clear a bunker with a Zippo, move forward, and then, hours later, the same bunker would start firing again. The Japanese were using the tunnel network to reinforce, resupply, and counterattack. Kill one group and another would take their place. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more grew back. The Zippos adapted. Staff Sergeant Meza's crew started working with infantry units, coordinating attacks so that Marines would follow the flamethrower tank, move into the bunker while the Japanese were still reeling from the flames, and toss grenades or satchel charges into the tunnel entrances to collapse them. It was dangerous. It was brutal, but it worked. One bunker on the northern edge of the WWII Plateau became the textbook example. The position had held up the 5th Marine Division for 2 full days. Artillery had hit it. Naval gunfire had pounded it. Infantry assaults had failed 3 times, with heavy casualties. The bunker was connected to a tunnel system that ran half a mile underground, allowing the Japanese to retreat, regroup, and come back stronger. Meza's Zippo rolled up at dawn. The plan was simple: burn the bunker, then send in a demolition team to blow the tunnel entrance before the Japanese could retreat. The tank stopped 100 yards out. Meza fired. The napalm hit. The bunker erupted in flames. But this time the Japanese didn't retreat. They stayed, kept firing, because inside they'd rigged the bunker with explosives, not to kill the Marines, to kill the tank. The moment the flamethrower stopped, a Japanese soldier triggered the charges. The explosion ripped through the bunker and sent a shockwave across the ash. Meza's tank rocked. The driver panicked, threw the Sherman into reverse. They pulled back, shaken but alive. The Marines moved in anyway. Grenades, satchel charges. They cleared the bunker room by room, dragged out the bodies, and found the tunnel entrance. A sergeant dropped a thermite grenade down the shaft, and the tunnel collapsed in a roar of smoke and flame. That position never fired again. But there were dozens more, hundreds, and the Zippos couldn't be everywhere at once. So the Marines started calling them in like air support. A unit would get pinned down, call for a flamethrower tank, and wait. Sometimes the Zippo would arrive in minutes. Sometimes it took hours. But when it came, it changed everything. Bunkers that had held up entire companies for days were reduced to smoking craters in seconds. The psychological effect was just as devastating. The Japanese had spent months preparing for the American assault. They'd built bunkers that could withstand bombs and shells. They'd trained to fight to the last man. They'd accepted death. But the flamethrowers, those were different. Those weren't just weapons. Those were horror, the sound of the napalm igniting, the sight of the fire flooding into your position, the smell, the heat, the screaming. You couldn't fight fire, you could only burn. Japanese prisoners, rare on Iwo Jima because most chose death over surrender, described the flamethrower tanks as demons. One soldier, captured near the WWII Plateau, told interrogators that the men in his unit had stopped trying to hold bunkers once the Zippos arrived. They knew they couldn't win, couldn't survive. All they could do was die faster. By early March, the Zippos had been in action for 2 weeks. They'd destroyed over 200 bunkers and pillboxes. They'd opened routes for Marine infantry that had been blocked for days. They'd turned the tide of battles that seemed unwinnable. And they'd done it with 8 tanks. 8 tanks, 8 crews, against 21,000 Japanese defenders in the most fortified position in the Pacific, and they were winning. But the battle wasn't over, because Kurabayashi was still alive, still commanding, still fighting, and he had one more card to play. By mid-March 1945, Iwo Jima was a graveyard. The Marines had pushed the Japanese into the northern tip of the island, a rocky, broken wasteland honeycombed with caves and tunnels. Kurabayashi's command post was somewhere in that maze, buried so deep that even the Zippos couldn't reach it. But the fight was over. Everyone knew it. The Japanese were cut off, surrounded, running out of food, water, ammunition. They couldn't retreat, couldn't resupply, couldn't win. But they could still kill. The final phase of the battle was the ugliest. No more banzai charges, no more coordinated defense. Just small groups of Japanese soldiers hiding in caves, waiting for Marines to walk by and then attacking with grenades, bayonets, knives. It was slow, it was grinding, and it was costing American lives every single day. The Zippos helped. They'd seal cave entrances, burn out holdouts, force the Japanese deeper underground. But even fire has limits. Some caves were too deep. Some tunnels had turns and bends that the napalm couldn't follow. The Marines would burn one entrance and the Japanese would escape through another. On March 21st, Kurabayashi sent a final radio message to Tokyo. He reported that he had fewer than 1,500 men left, that he was preparing a final attack, that he would die fighting. The message was intercepted by American intelligence, and the Marines braced for one last banzai charge. It never came, not the way they expected. Instead, small groups of Japanese soldiers, maybe 50, maybe 100, began crawling out of the caves at night, moving silently through the darkness and attacking Marine positions with whatever they had left. Swords, grenades, bare hands. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't strategic. It was desperation. It was death. And it lasted for days. The Zippos couldn't help with that. You can't burn shadows. You can't flamethrower the darkness. So the tanks stayed back, supporting infantry sweeps during the day, sealing caves, clearing bunkers. By March 26, 36 days after the first Marines hit the beach, Iwo Jima was declared secure. Kuribayashi was dead. The garrison was destroyed. The island was American. But the cost was staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed, over 19,000 wounded, casualty rates so high that entire companies were wiped out and rebuilt multiple times. The Japanese lost 18,000 killed, almost their entire garrison. Only about 1,000 were taken prisoner, most of them too wounded to resist. And the Zippos, all 8 survived the battle. Battered, scorched, mechanical nightmares held together with spare parts and prayer, but they survived. The crew's men like Staff Sergeant Robert Meza came home. Some of them talked about what they'd done. Most didn't. Because how do you explain what it's like to burn men alive? How do you describe the smell, the sound, the screaming? How do you sleep after that? But here's the thing, the Zippos worked. They saved lives, Marine lives. For every bunker burned, for every pillbox destroyed, there were Marines who didn't have to charge across open ground into machine gun fire. There were families who got their sons back. There were men who lived because the Zippos killed first. The flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima proved something the rest of the war would confirm. Fire wins. Not because it's honorable, not because it's clean, but because it works. And in a war like that, where the enemy builds fortresses underground and fights to the death, sometimes you need to fight fire with fire. Literally.